Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the first event for Queen Mary Conversations in a week of conversation between artists and academics at Queen Mary. We're so delighted you're joining us. Thank you very much for being here with us. And I should explain that the reason that we're hosting these is that last year at the beginning of lockdown, what we felt was that one of the things people needed to do most of all was to talk. So we gave the opportunity to 27 artists, arts workers and community organisations to have conversations with academics at Queen Mary. We've curated the outcomes of those events online, which you can have a look at our Queen Mary Conversations website. So this week is a week of conversation among artists and academics to celebrate those commissions. And this very first event celebrates a really serendipitous meeting of minds. When I talked to the performance artist Stacy Makishi and asked her what she was interested in, she told me she was working with household objects and thinking about magic rituals. And it just so turned out that one of our historians, Rhodri Hayward, was interested in pretty much exactly the same things, in the histories of tidying up and magic. So we put them together for a conversation, and it went so well we wanted to celebrate it by bringing more people into that chat. So we called this event And First Some Housekeeping, because anyone who's attended an academic conference will be very familiar with the moment where the host, having spoken about high and abstract concepts, difficult ideas, major politics, will say, we'll start the event, but first some housekeeping. And then they tell us where the toilets are and when the coffee break is coming up. And what's really interesting about the use of housekeeping in those terms is that it brackets housekeeping as something that's not terribly important, something we have to get through before we get to the real ideas. And yet, of course, if any of you have been to an academic event, you will know that knowing when the coffee's coming up and whether there's biscuits is actually probably one of the most important pieces of information you'll get that day. So we want to recognize really how housekeeping is often ignored or repressed or not taken very seriously, and yet actually has a fundamental importance in our lived experiences. It has a history, a geography, a politics, a set of practices, and of course has been engaged by important feminist artists like Bobby Baker, who uses boxes of detergent and baking to make autobiographical work. Or think of the work of Tracy Emin and her Dirty Bed, which caused such controversy in 1998 at the tape as part of the Turner Prize that a self-named South Wales housewife made a 200-mile journey by train armed with cleaning products to try and clean up the installation. In fact, the installation was ruined the following year by a museum cleaner who thought it had been vandalized and tidied it up. Academics, though, have given this question slightly less attention until recently, and I'm incredibly pleased to be able to invite and introduce some really interesting thinkers on this front. Before I start, I just want to invite you all to join the conversation. You'll see that there's a Q&A function as part of this webinar. Please do add your thoughts, questions, ideas, comments to that as we go, because I will draw on those to have a chat with all of the speakers. And I should say, we are finishing this event with a tailor-made commissioned household ritual performed for us by Stacy Makishi. We've sent you the instructions for that. I just want to remind you that she's asked us to have a pen, paper and mirror handy to move around your house. So you may want to tune into the performance from your mobile phone, to use headphones if at all possible. And do note that this piece will talk about loss. We'll take a few minutes to prepare ourselves for that. And even if you're someone who is appalled by the idea of audience participation, do remember you are at home in your own houses, and this is something that will bring you genuine joy. So I'm going to introduce with great pleasure our first speaker for this evening, and I'm going to ask him a few questions. Who is Rhodri Hayward, who had that initial conversation with Stacy? And Rhodri is the co-founder of our Centre for the History of Emotions at Queen Mary, and also the co-founder for the Centre of the Study of the Home. So it's like a perfect combination of interests, Rhodri. So Rhodri, join me in a conversation. And let me ask you this, first of all, could you tell us in a sort of 10 words or less answer what an historian of the emotions does? What do you study?
Well, I think you can guess. So I study the history of emotions, and my basic point would be, why do we see the emotions as not having a history? So people treat it as problem. I've gone over 10 words, and that was an almost impossible brief. But people treat emotions as somehow being outside history, when our lot would argue that they're absolutely fundamental to the way we experience history and to what history is.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm interested by the recent fad for tidying up that we're seeing in the kind of craze for Marie Kondo's work, for example. And I wonder, as an historian of the emotions, what you would say we're doing when we're tidying up. What sort of mess are we actually engaging with when we enact the rituals of tidying up?
Well, I'm really glad you asked me that question, Aoife. And it's a question I've kind of been thinking about for the last few years, because as somebody, kind of midlife kind of like academic whose career is always in a low level of crisis, I spend a lot of my time ending up in the kind of like self-help sections of bookshops. And if you go into the self-help section, as I often do, one thing that you will have noticed over the last decade is that in the 1980s to 1990s, all the books used to be about dealing with your memory, and now they tend to be about dealing with your stuff. And I just wondered what was going on when I was kind of looking at these things. And I'm somebody who suffers from too much stuff. I started to wonder what's going on, but we suddenly want to engage with our lives, not by dissecting our past, not by engaging with the kind of like stories we tell about ourselves, but actually engaging with the things around us. And there's different ways we can tell that story. So partly, I think what's happened is that we've started to realize that emotions are very much made up, not just by stuff that's going on inside of us, but by the way that we interact with the wider world. So at the same time that you suddenly get all these books appearing, you suddenly get new kinds of mental illness appearing, and we could talk about hoarding disorder. You get new ways of making sense of mental illness. And I teach history of psychiatry courses to my students. And so in making sense of mental illness, you suddenly get this moment whereby psychiatrists are making use of things like clutter inventories. And so you suddenly have this moment where you no longer diagnose somebody by looking at their life or interviewing them. You can diagnose somebody on the basis of how cluttered their home is. You can go in with a graph and take a look at the room and actually kind of work out what's going on inside a person. So that's going on in psychiatry. And at the same time, if you pick up the papers, there's always new emotions around, like road rage. Of course, you're going to get road rage if you've got a car. You can't really get it if you're lying in bed. And more recently, you've got this huge literature about something like hygge, this Danish emotion, which a lot of you will know is kind of like this kind of sense of coziness. But hygge you can only achieve, you can't just be hygge on your own. You kind of got to go to John Lewis and buy the scented candles and have the pine cabin and these kind of things. So there's a sense in which, just at the time that academics and historians are getting interested in the way that emotions are part of a world, the whole world is also picking up on this idea that emotions aren't particularly about us, they're about the world that we live with and the world we interact with. And like most academics, I haven't actually answered your question, but I've just talked about what I want to talk about. So I can come, do you want to ask you a question again, Aoife, to remind me?
Well, Rhodri, I think you've not asked my question very brilliantly. Thank you. And I do.
Well, that's what I was aiming for.
I'm so interested by the fact, as an historian of the emotions, what you're pointing up is that there are feelings that come into fashion or have a certain kind of zeitgeist, a certain moment where those feelings are, particularly felt and potent. And what you're suggesting there is that tidying or objects are actually a way we access feeling, produce feeling, and perhaps lodge ourselves in the world. Could you talk a bit more about some of the kind of histories of thought behind that?
Yeah, so basically, when you first ask a question about what is the history of emotions, normally that always puts us on the back foot, and we have to justify the idea that emotions have a history. And the way that historians have done that usually is by saying, like, look, the language that we use to make sense of ourselves changes. We have emotions in the past that are no longer with us. There's emotions in other cultures. I come from Wales, and we talk about an emotion called hiraeth, which you supposedly don't get in England, just like we only just got hygge recently. from Denmark. So first of all, we talked about emotions being made through language, but now we talk about them being made through the actual things that we have, or through the labour that we engage in, through the way that we interact with stuff. And so I think there's been this turn to material culture as one of the sources we actually make our feelings with. Because one of the things that a lot of philosophers have written about since the mid-20th century, and I kind of agree with, is actually none of us have much idea what's going on in ourselves. So we have a feeling, and we kind of like, I kind of feel vaguely disgruntled most of the time, but I've got no idea quite what that feeling is. And so I can like pick on a term to make sense of it, but also, and more commonly, and I think there's something that artists do, and Stacey were doing rather brilliantly, you kind of like pick up objects and try to work it out of yourself, or you do stuff to try and work it out of yourself. So actually finding those feelings isn't just a linguistic process, it's also a very active and engaged process, and it changes according to the materials that you have access to. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And that makes me wonder, just looking at your work, you talk a little bit about the ways in which the inner life may be experienced as messy, and that our relationship to objects may be something to do with a relationship to tidying up our inner lives. So talk to me a little bit about housework, and how housework and magic might both be possibly working to tidy us up emotionally.
Right. So there's a philosopher of history who I'm really interested in called R.G. Colin Woods, and he's kind of most famous for, he wrote a very long book called The Idea of History about historians trying to get in touch with the past. But he was also interested in how ordinary people try to get in touch with themselves. And he said you can do it in a number of ways. He said, basically, we all have this kind of like messy energy going on inside of ourselves. We find it very hard to get a grip on it. So if we do it according to Colin Wood, the best way that we do this is by practically engaging with the world, by doing something to try and work it out and actually find out what it is by seeing it out there. And it's most successful in work of people like you and Stacey, but actually produces art. So an artwork is somebody who's actually managed to convey their feeling into a material object. But for most people, what we tend to do is we take that feeling and turn it into something useful. We turn it into working for the principal at QM. We turn it into our, our student returns or our ref return or something like that. So we take that energy and try and work it out, but we work it out around a template which kind of partly belongs to somebody else, but it's still hugely productive. So we have like, we all are taught certain ways of being, and we adopt those ways, and that kind of channels the energies. So what point am I making? But basically, art itself and magic itself are ways of turning that kind of chaotic inner life into things which are out there. Now, very few of us kind of like live our lives as a work of art. Very few of us kind of like pursue an artistic career, but most of us, I would argue, in the house at least, try to do something which somehow reflects us, or we try to work out what's going on. We try to make a way of living which will actually change the way we feel in the world. And so I think the closest that most of us get to artistic creation is housework itself. Now, I know that other panelists such as Sophie and Tommy are going to be talking about very different experiences of labour and housework. So it's not something which people are doing as an act of artistic creation. It's something people are doing, in picking up after very messy students, or as part of kind of like frontline labour in different countries. So there's a whole question of alienation, and we could start going on about Marx, which I'd love to do. But, but there's Marx who said, when we labour, we're not just making an object, we're also remaking who we are. We're actually changing a kind of, we're changing the kind of people we are, the way we live in the world. So there's a kind of mysterious process going on there, which is good to get a grip on.
Well, what I think what you're offering is a way of honoring the work of housework, actually, and recognizing the care and importance it can take on in ways that often have been devalued because it's gendered and so on. So there's something powerful in what you're saying. I wonder, could we finish, Rhodri, just by talking to us a little bit about magic, more specifically about incantations and spells, and how they might also be doing a certain kind of tidying up. So leave us with a little insight into magic. and the histories of magic?
Well, okay, so I don't know the kind of grand secret of magic or the arcana, but one way of thinking about magic, it's about making a new reality for yourself. And when you're making a new reality, you're not just changing the outside world, you're kind of changing a way that you perceive it. And through that act of perception, it's kind of alchemical, and you're changing the inner world as well. So I think the closest we get to a magical act in our everyday lives is through this everyday practical engagement. It's like the world, so people who practice magic, say the world is very rich and strange, it's absolutely full of information, and we're all filtering it. And certain magical practitioners would argue that we filter out a lot of excess and really interesting information. We filter out, supernatural. We're kind of like blind to the wondrous nature of the world. And if we want to recapture that wonder, then we have to find new ways of engaging with it. And on a very tiny, tiny, small scale, housework, I think, is part of that. So,
and what a great note to finish. Thank you so much, Rhodri. I'm calling you back for some Q&A at the end, but for now, thank you very much. And can I welcome again audiences to kind of add their questions and thoughts to the Q&A, and I will ask our speakers as we go along. I wonder if I could invite Tommy to join us now, who is the Assistant Residences Operations Manager, who's part of the Queen Mary Residential Support Team. Tommy, are you there? You are there. Hello.
I am here indeed. Hello, hello, hello.
Thank you so much for joining us, Tommy. What a treat to have you. Could you tell us, again, slightly unfairly, like with Rhodri, in a 10-word or less answer, what your job title means? What do you do for Queen Mary?
So myself and the residences team, we are in many ways the first port of call for all the queries, issues and concerns relating to residence time in Queen Mary residential accommodation. And we also look at improving the student experience and, running events and overall just making sure that the students have an excellent time, or as excellent as they can do, while they're with us at Queen Mary.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tommy. Now, when we met last, you told me that one of the most watched videos on the Queen Mary student pages online was a video on how to do your laundry. And I think that's such a beautiful insight into what skills students most need to develop when they come onto campus. So I wonder what you have found when students arrive and live in halls for the first time, living away from home often for the first time. What do they need to learn? What are the skills that they're missing that they have to acquire?
So I suppose the best way to sort of summarize what students most need to learn is probably like independence and living independently. And obviously that comes with, there's a lot of things that are associated with that. So obviously time management and setting routines for yourself, learning to have a grasp on cooking, doing your own laundry, ironing your own clothes. Last week I showed a resident how to change and make their bed. So everyone comes in at completely different levels. Some people are really independent and ready to live on their own and have got all the bells and whistles ready to go. And some people, that they've had the luxury of a home cooked meal every day with all their laundry all done and ready and ironed for them. As well as that, obviously you've got financial responsibilities and grappling with budget management. Obviously on the first day the student loan drops, there's an army of moped drivers descending onto campus, but housing services, the team that we work with in the residences team, they offer excellent advice for students who are struggling financially or in need of some financial advice. And most importantly for this conversation anyway is not just how to clean, but how to clean effectively. It's important for students to remember that their university halls is where they work their magic. So it's important that their cauldrons are cleaned and their workspace is prepared with all the necessary tools and potions.
Brilliant. You don't want those spells going wrong.
No way.
I mean, I think I told you when we met that one of my advisees, I asked my students what they were most worried about with starting at university, and it wasn't dealing with works of Shakespeare, it was how long it took to boil peas. And I was able to offer him immediate and very practical advice on that. It was great to feel useful. I imagine you have some entertaining horror stories to share with us. I don't know if you've got any PG rated ones without naming names that you'd be willing to tell us about.
Yeah, so I wish I could remember them all, but nowadays my head's filled with health and safety procedures and email threads, like many other people these days. But just some off the top of my head. You've got the classic, let's see how many dirty plates we can stack on top of each other before they topple over, or before they get a knock at the door from me asking them why there's a load of smashed plates on the kitchen floor. Yeah. We have lost a lot of ovens recently, funnily enough, because some students can't seem to grasp that you need to take the pizza off of the plastic holder and then put it onto a pizza tray before cooking it, and then trying to remain awake whilst it's cooking. So a good piece of advice I would have for some students living in halls would be order a takeaway when you get home, or have some leftovers ready, because you're going to need them, and you sometimes you're not going to be able to stay awake while you're cooking a pizza or decide to make a lasagna at 3 in the morning, because there's going to be some people that wake up in the morning that are going to see a bit of a crime scene of pasta sheets and mince all over the floor.
That you are making me feel anxious thinking about the way the students I teach, you know, the worry of what happens to them late at night. That's conjuring up all kinds of images. And I wonder if do you have any lovely stories about students meeting through housework? Because one of the things that I certainly experience working with advisees as the person who teaches them is homesickness. I mean, it's how hard it is to leave home and to be young and to navigate the world for the first time. Do students get to know each other through their household rituals?
Certainly. I would say learning to do housework together, creating some some cleaning routines together is definitely an excellent way to get an idea of who you're going to live with in your second year, who's on your same wavelength, because as I mentioned, everyone comes in at different levels with different expectations of what they think is clean, what they think someone else's cleanliness is like, and ultimately what the university deemed clean as well. But I don't have any love stories, because we don't tend to get that involved in our residents' lives. But this year we did run a Valentine's initiative in which we asked residents to nominate another resident for a prize, but they'd have to provide a reason for doing so. And some of the responses were definitely very, very heartwarming. I've got a couple here. So we've got another one here would be, we've known each other for such a short period of time, but she feels like my soul sister. She's the most supportive and caring person I've encountered, and a great voice of reason during my tumultuous times. So that was really heartwarming. We do see students really get together, and by the end of the year, some people who were struggling to make friends or struggling to sort of get on and get used to living independently, when they learn to rely on their other flatmates who are all in the same position as well, you really see some great friendships forming, and it's really nice to see, especially at the end of the year when everyone's coming to the end of their time. Also, we do capture feedback every year to get an idea of an insight into the students' experience in halls. And what comes back time and time and again is the positive messages that the residents have about their cleaners. And it's lovely to see that the hard work that the cleaners do is recognised by the residents. So it's really nice to see that sort of that relationship forming between the resident and the cleaners.
That's fantastic. Those are such brilliant stories, Tommy, and actually really resonate with what Rhodri was saying about how people find their place in the world through their household rituals. It sounds like they're also finding their place among their peers and establishing those amazing friendships and relationships to cleaners who must be really important in their lives.
Definitely.
That actually, bring them into the rest of their lives. It's a beautiful thing. Just to finish, you revealed to me, which I think is an amazing moment of serendipity again, that your final year dissertation was on the history of witchcraft. You're a history student by trade. So you actually know quite a lot about magic as well as housekeeping. And I wondered whether you'd come across any interesting superstitions or rituals that students engaged in around their household objects.
Well, the main one that springs to mind, and I'm not sure why, and it's a strange phenomenon, I was guilty of it too when I was at university, but students absolutely love empty glass alcohol bottles, and they love displaying them for all to see. I'm unsure as to the reason why. I can only assume it's a status thing, or look what we can achieve if we work together. But certainly the alcohol bottles are highly treasured and highly sought after in the university halls, at least at Queen Mary anyway.
We won't think too hard about that, Tommy. And I have to say, I have witnessed those collections in my own past too, so I can only imagine. Listen, Tommy, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. And I'm also really grateful for the opportunity to celebrate the work that you and the team do, which is so vital for our students' experience of university and often not acknowledged well enough. So thank you for your work and thank you for being here. I'll pull you back in again for the Q&A. Somebody has said actually in the Q&A, asking whether you blogged or Instagrammed your how-to advice, suggesting it would be quite popular information beyond just new students. So older students might also find it useful. So maybe we'll talk about that actually, about, you know, whether we can do that together at another juncture. I
can certainly link the residence's Instagram page as well, which has all that information.
That would be great. Thanks, Tommy. That's fantastic.
No,
brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm going to call on Laura Humphreys now to join me, who is the Curatorial and Connections Engagement Project Manager at the Science Museum, and is also the author of one of the most appropriate books for this panel, a book called Globalising Housework, Domestic Labour in Middle-Class London Homes from 1850 to 1914. Laura, we're so pleased to have you join us. Thank you very much. I can't think of more appropriate research for this panel. So let me ask you, you put household rituals of cooking and cleaning and childcare at the heart of your study of housekeeping, and you really are thinking about these practices during the histories of the British Empire in many ways. I wonder, could you talk a little bit about some of the cleaning rituals that you came across in the course of your research, both ones that might be actually really culturally specific or geographically specific, and also maybe the ways in which cleaning was a culture that got exported through the empire in very specific practices. It was made homogenous through the empire. What did you come across in the histories of cleaning in your work?
Oh, so much. So I have to give a shout out, as all historical geographers of the home do, to the great Lenore Davidoff for coming up with the rituals of order, as they're called: cooking, cleaning, and childcare. Childcare is a bit different. You don't have to have childcare going on in a home, and there's lots of other rituals you could argue are happening that are housework. But she argued particularly for sort of 18th and 19th century homes, with sort of the deification of the mother, that childcare was a really important part of sort of the ideal. So I have to give credit to her for coming up with the rituals, and for just paving the way for so many scholars of home and housework and domesticity, which is particularly a women's history and geography, that had not received, as you said in your introduction, it sometimes gets overlooked and doesn't receive the attention it deserves, as something that we all do every day, whether we do it well or badly or a lot or a little. It's something we all engage with. In terms of the British Empire and cleaning and sort of the wider world in general, it wasn't just the empire. It actually became quite a different thing, I would say, in the late 19th century, because you've got a couple of different booms and big changes going on, one of which was a boom in print culture and advertising. And cleaning starts to be used alongside the empire in a lot of imagery, and a lot of it's very explicitly racist. So there are some quite famous images of things like imperial leather soap washing black or brown skin white. And then you get jokes a couple of years later in Punch magazine, where Punch magazine are actually taking the mick out of that being a ridiculous stereotype. So very quickly, the cynicism around advertising appears alongside advertising. But imperialism is often shown as sort of a cleansing force. And you get cleaning metaphors mixed up with battleground metaphors. And that sort of conflict comes into the home, and it becomes a constant battle against dirt, and that's always very tied up with sort of imperial language around this sort of high imperial time in Britain, and in London in particular, because London is such an international global city. London homes have first and easiest access to foreign goods, technologies, ideas, immigrants, who are all moving within the space of home. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant of like, empire's got everything to do with housework. It does. An alternative title for my book is Everything in Your House is Racist, Here's Why.
Yeah, I mean, some of those images from those advertisements are astonishing, aren't they? And there is something very powerful about the ways in which dirt is literalized as a thing that has to be battled and also constantly rendered symbolic and used to define certain groups and communities. Could I jump on what you said about the idea of the home, because I'm wondering what home meant in that period. And I'm going to ask about English homes rather than British homes. So what does an English home mean? How is it understood, and how does that relate to empire?
So like Rhodri, I'm Welsh, so I'm quite fascinated with what the difference between English and British is. And it's quite striking when you look at the home alongside the empire, because everything in the empire is British. So it's the British Empire. It's never the English Empire. It's the British Virgin Islands, British Honduras, British India, some of which still exist, of course. It's never an English imperial dominion. It's never an English colony. But then when you come back to sort of the domestic, both on sort of in terms of being in the UK and also on a domestic level, English starts to take precedence, and this idea of an Englishman's home and is his castle, a quintessentially English household, is something that both sort of British people and also a lot of foreign writers who visit the UK, they see it as a concept. And there's one travel writer, Behramji Malabari, who was an Indian writer and activist. He said that an English home can exist outside of England. It's that specific a thing. But then you have the flip side of this, where it is in itself a tool of empire and British dominion. British famous Welsh nationalist and historian Gwynfor Evans is always quoted in these debates saying, Britishness is Englishness. Britishness is used to extend an identity over the Welsh, the Scottish and the Irish that they don't ask for, but it's a way of lumping them in to be sort of part of the a certain part of the empire. But then when you come home, actually they're treated very differently. So it's really quite complex. But the English home versus the British Empire, it's a really interesting, I think, meeting of two very different kinds of imperial rule, and extending a rule that essentially originates in London out over different kinds of nations.
And of course, I'm sure if you look at those histories of how dirt is being used to being applied to communities, that's also actually happening within Britain around the racialization of, say, the Irish in those terms. So there's something really interesting there too around what counts as English, and that earlier question that you raised around racism. You say in your book, I thought it was really interesting, that when housekeeping and housework is thought about sort of in the popular imagination around the Victorian period, it's often in relation to the big house, to aristocracy, to the servant class. And you suggest that we should also be thinking about the smaller house, the rented accommodation, and how housework actually happened in those. So I wonder, could you tell us, just to finish up, what changes when we pay attention to those other kinds of houses? What happens to our understanding of housework? So,
yeah, I think Downton Abbey, etc., has got quite a lot to answer for. And also the National Trust to an extent, because the sort of physical spaces of housework, like these enormous, almost industrial kitchens, which are complexes of rooms, not just a kitchen, they survive in those big houses. And then we see in popular culture a lot of depictions of these armies of stewards, and there's male and female servants, there's 30 plus if we're talking palace or grand aristocratic house. That's how it survives in the popular imagination. That's what people tend to think of as these clearly defined roles. But actually, for the majority of domestic workers in the 19th and 20th century, at least, the reality is actually single servants who are, the vast majority of whom, over 90% were women, were working alone or alongside their employer in a middle-class household. So it's a really different thing. And if you see something like Downton Abbey, where that kind of service is really hierarchical, and you can have some sort of approaching middle-class people working in those kinds of houses as servants as well, it's very much a lone battle for most people. It is physically demanding work. It's really, it's quite insecure employment for a lot of people. But it's also insecure support for a lot of householders as well. So there's a lot of, particularly in London, there's a lot of people moving around all the time because there's so many different job opportunities. And something that you get a lot in sort of printed magazines and things is people complain that you can't get good servants, and when you do, they never stay. But actually, that's been going on for hundreds of years as well. I think it's in As You Like It, one of Shakespeare's plays, there's a line that none will sweat but for promotion, just basically saying you can't get the staff. So it's a very different dynamic to the one that we think of where, you know, the housekeeper worked at Chatsworth for 30 years. It's really different, and it's a really interesting point of working class and middle class sort of coming together, and very often a site of conflict where people are saying, well, this is quite well paid, you get your accommodation a lot of the time, why is this not a more attractive prospect for you, the labouring classes? And it's because that there's also a total absence of freedom. You're on duty 24/7. Your home is your workplace, something that we're all becoming acutely familiar with now, whether we like it or not. Home as workplace is very often very uncomfortable. I certainly have a new appreciation for how difficult it is to work where you live, and vice versa. So that's the difference for me. And it's, as much as I'm a historian, I have to love things like Downton Abbey, but it's not the majority experience. And there's something really important there about how housework looks different, and it wasn't based on armies of servants. It was still really difficult and a solitary task.
That's such a brilliant note to end on, Laura. Thank you so much for your insight. I think your book's brilliant. I recommend everybody reads it because I loved reading it myself. And I think what you're saying about class and gender brings us beautifully into talking to our final speaker, Sophie Harman, who is Professor of International Politics at Queen Mary, who has worked with the UN and the World Health Organization on research projects concerning global health governance, the World Bank, and the HIV/AIDS partnership in health in Africa, and also the 2014-15 Ebola response. She's currently writing a book on women, gender, and global health, and has just published a major report for UN Women, which I thought was incredibly pertinent to this conversation, because so much of it concerns questions of women's work, cleaning, and hygiene. Sophie, thank you for being here. I wonder if one of the things I thought was fascinating in your report was the way that it pointed to how much women are caught in a kind of nexus of paid work that actually puts them in the so-called front line, although you may want to contest that term, but you know, actually being far more exposed to illness and the virus, while also doing certain kinds of other non-paid work that is also actually rendering them vulnerable, or they're taking on more of it because of the pandemic. So could you talk a bit about that nexus and what happens to women in lockdown?
Oh, that's a big question. I think my laptop's just gone sticky, which is a good cleaning reference. Yeah, so we've known from previous pandemics, from Ebola, Zika, HIV and AIDS, that you combat, again, I don't like the militarized language, or you respond to a pandemic in the home. This is where you respond. So it's either from women doing care work, or it's around cleaning or behavior change. And so you see that happening in previous health crises. And COVID-19 has been no different, and it exacerbates gender relations. It doesn't create new gender relations, or at least we haven't seen that so far. What's kind of frustrating when you're someone who's been working on this for a long time, like me, is that you knew that this was coming, and you try to sort of say to governments, UN agencies, we need to prepare, otherwise women are going to be absolutely screwed. And even those who think it's magical to do housework, it's not going to be like that for everybody. And so some of the trends you can see are that everyone's doing more housework. So men are doing more, but women are doing even more. And that's a global phenomenon. One thing you have to bear in mind is men always over-report the amount of housework they're doing, and women always under-report it. So I think that can also tell you something. And then there's a kind of wider question of people talking about, well, actually, does this mean that there'll be a change in valuing care work and valuing housework? Now people actually, well, men recognize the drudgery and the magic that goes into it a little bit more because they're in the house more. And I'm not so convinced. I think everyone just wants to leave their homes and get away from housework, definitely not recognizing its value. So we can see some trends there. And I think what's important when you think about it of pandemics is not that just women take on this extra responsibility to end the pandemic by doing new forms of housework, like cleaning your shopping. I mean, I haven't done this, but you know, my dad was big keen on this, but it was my dad's partner that was doing this, obviously. Who washes their shopping? Washing clothes when you come in, like everyone going Dettol mad. These are the sort of new trends that you see, and so it'd be interesting to see if that stays around. But this also makes women more vulnerable because it actually reproduces this idea that they are responsible for care work, that labour just goes uncounted. And I think that's going to be a problem when we look at what happens to women's labour after the pandemic, and we can reflect a bit on that with some of the aspects of the furlough scheme as well, particularly in the UK. But I want to be a bit more positive because I feel like this is a Friday evening and I come with the international politics and it's all doom and gloom. And I think what's very interesting is how people use art to make sense of pandemics. Again, we've seen this with HIV and AIDS massively. We saw this with Ebola, and you're seeing it now with COVID-19. So even if that's the rainbows in people's houses or people sort of doing graffiti around the pandemic, it really, when I was listening to Rhodri actually, it reminded me, I have a friend that I befriended with Age UK. And before I met her, Age UK said to me, so just so you know, she has complex health needs and she loves stickers. And I was like, okay, fine. Okay, cool. And then I went into her house. And so if you can imagine pink paints and then floor and ceiling covered in stickers, like covered in stickers, in front of them, you know, teddy bears with sunglasses, and it's a piece of art. And every time her health flares up, you see more stickers coming up, more poems coming up on the walls. At the same time, she has the largest collection of Dettol I have ever seen. She expresses herself through art and cleaning, and that is very much a response to some of her health needs. Obviously, ethically, I'm never going to make her one of my projects because she's my friend. But I think it really speaks to this, you know, what do people do when they are trying to make sense of the world around them? And I think art and cleaning intersect in really interesting ways like that.
That's so fascinating, Sophie. And you're making me think that one of the aspects of pandemic I've been interested in is the clapping for carers moment, which I think has been rightly criticised for sentimentalising the work of the NHS in such a way that it's almost then possible to only offer a 1% pay rise. But one thing I wondered was whether that communal act of applause, which of course is a theatrical act, was also a way of creating cohesion and community that made it possible to lock down, because it's sort of producing the promise and the commitment of that sort of that social commitment. So there's something really fascinating about the ways that organized people's relationship to each other in space. Seemed to enable a certain way of being during lockdown.
Yeah, I was always very fascinated by Clap for Carers, because I always felt very moved at the first and then angry about it and then quite uncomfortable about it. I mean, this comes back again to the emotions linked to it, right? And you know, at the start, I talked to lots of media people who were saying, is this going to change how we value care, how we value nurses? And I always thought, well, no, you know, we've always valued nurses more than we valued bankers. We just don't pay them. That's just how modern capitalism works. But I think that communal experience is really important. And it's very interesting how that's shifted, how that started, you know, the more angry we got. I think at first everyone was like, we're all in this together. And then everyone realized we're not all in this together, or, you know, other people are much more comfortable. And so that definitely changed in that respect. I think it was noticeable when, you know, Boris Johnson wanted us to light a candle, and, you know, looking on my street, there were no candles. And I think everyone was just like, you know what, screw you, Boris, you know, light your own candle, try and save some people. And you know, this comes out around the same nurses, but, you know, the public's not daft in that sense. So yeah, I think it was Clap for Carers about our commitment to care and the NHS, or was it actually about social cohesion and coming together and actually seeing someone that is not your kitchen or the pile of washing up that is there at the end of every day and seems bigger and bigger as this goes on?
Absolutely. It's fascinating. Of course, clapping is never an unambivalent activity anyway. It could be an act of derision as well as, celebration. I know that your report offers the sobering statistic that 3 billion people lack basic hygiene facilities in their homes globally. And I'm wondering about the ways in which the act of washing hands demonstrates those global inequalities. So can you talk a little bit about how the gendered responsibilities for hygiene and sanitation, you've already touched on that actually, the washing of the shopping. How has the pandemic shown these questions up?
Yes, so I think it's done it in lots of interesting ways. So again, it refers back to my initial point that pandemics start in the home and women do most of the homework. So in that sense, it's going to start with women's labour, and that again relies on them. So that's more washing of the hands, washing of children, washing of everything. But of course there's stark inequalities there. So that's going to be harder if you don't have access to clean water. Then, I mean, right at the start of the pandemic last year, lots of people were really freaking out about what was going to happen in low-income countries, for example, where water and sanitation is a huge issue and hygiene is a huge issue. But what we learned actually from the Ebola response is if you work with women in the community, the innovations that they come up with are, of course, resilient, which I hate that word, but they know what to do. And so you're like, right, what do we need to get you to deal with this crisis? What the problem happens is after the crisis, where all that will to do something around hygiene and sanitation and all the money to deal with the emergency just goes. So you have this moment of crisis where you have an intervention and then that goes. And so it's how do you sort of capture that as well? And then I think there's the sort of dark side of hygiene and sanitation and how people access it. So COVID-19 again is that great amplifier of inequality, but it's also the risk of women accessing hygiene facilities, accessing water facilities. And I know in particularly in humanitarian contexts, there's a real concern around threat of violence against women, around public toilets, public hand washing stations, and how you sort of but put in place certain risk management around that. And then finally, I think if you get hygiene and sanitation right, you will deal with so many of global health problems. But water is never seen as a threat to the global north, so it's never going to be a high profile issue that gets the amount of money that something like the response to Ebola or COVID-19 will, and that's a real shame.
There's a real resonance there with the ways in which homelessness was dealt with in Britain during the first lockdown, where homeless people were miraculously housed, and of course that solution has already actually started to recede, so that's incredibly striking. I wonder, could we finish just by talking quickly about the conditions of work for cleaners in hospitals and care homes during COVID? Obviously, again, clap for carers really framed nurses and doctors as heroes, but those who clean, and again, your report reveals that 74% of cleaners and helpers are women, those who clean are incredibly important. So I wonder, could you talk a little bit about their conditions of work during this time?
Yeah, so I haven't looked at cleaners specifically, and when you sent me these kind of suggested questions, I was like, I want to do a project on the international politics of cleaners. You know, what do the cleaners see from diplomacy to global health? But coming back to your question, I think what's really interesting is in previous outbreaks, cleaners got hazard pay. So in the Ebola response, they paid cleaners hazard pay to make people go and work in the hospitals because no one wanted to do it. Whereas you didn't see that so much in the UK. And so you also saw when you paid hazard pay, more men started to do it because it became more appealing because the work was higher paid. Then the cleaners went on strike because that hazard pay wasn't paid. So when I was sort of thinking this through, I was like, okay, COVID cleaners in hospitals didn't get hazard pay. If they'd asked for hazard pay, can you just imagine the Daily Mail headline? And then I thought, hang on, are Queen Mary cleaners getting hazard pay? Because I don't think they are. Will they get hazard pay when the university opens up again for students coming on campus? And so it's one of those things, we're kind of now recognizing the value of cleaners, how fundamental they are to all walks of life, again, pandemics. but they're quick to be stigmatized. So if they say, okay, but we want better money, we want more, you know, or this is a hazardous job, there's quickly criticized, you know, the clapping goes away. And I think when nurses or doctors strike, there's always a controversy. And I think you're going to see that if you see that with cleaners as well. But, you know, cleaners love cleaners. Cleaners, they have labor, they need to be valued, it needs to be rewarded, and they need hazard pay.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you, Sophie. That's fantastic. I wonder, could I invite the other speakers to join us? We just have a few minutes left for questions. I think I got a bit overexcited in my conversations with everybody. We have a few questions that have come into the Q&A, but please do send us more so I can ask the speakers. Thank you all so much for that really superb set of responses to this theme. I mean, what an amazing array of kind of perspectives and histories and practices. It's phenomenal. I wonder if I could ask the speakers to talk to each other for a minute, since this is supposed to be a conversation after all, and to talk to each other, to ask each other questions perhaps about this relationship between housework and magic, because I think, Sophie, you suggested, you know, it really isn't always magic. And perhaps that kind of sentimentalization of the clapping is doing that sort of work of turning something into magic that is in fact hard work. But then, of course, Rhodri, you're suggesting that magic and hard work actually have things in common psychologically, which is also fascinating. So I wonder, would anyone like to jump into this kind of interconnection between cleaning and magic, and any initial responses to what each other are saying? Rhodri, I think you're muted. Are you muted?
No, I was muted. I'm not anymore. Just very briefly on clapping and magic. I mean, one of the things about the clap, and I think my attitudes for clap followed exactly the same arc as Sophie's, of kind of like briefly enchanted, and then by the end of the whole process, completely disenchanted with what's going on. Is when that act of clapping, what it did was it kind of enforces a kind of solidarity, because we all share an emotion. So you think, how do you make a group of people? How do you make a group identity? Partly you make it by having a feeling in common. And there was a really interesting and concerted attempt to, you know, to magic up a group by the government. And by the end of the process, we very much saw that spell failing. So the object that had been brought together, this idea of a nation in solidarity, had completely come apart, you know, through the actions of policy advisors, through press reporting, whatever. So, you know, the kind of flimsy fabric of the Wizard of Oz quickly goes. But it gives you a good example of a way that emotion and practice is interwoven and how it makes groups.
Laura, do you have a sense of that group making that emerges through practices like cleanliness and dirt, for example? Is that a group making structure?
Ooh, having said it's quite an isolating, it can be quite an isolating experience for a lot of people that were working alone. One of the groups that does emerge is a union. So there's sort of, in the early 20th century, there are some efforts to unionize domestic workers, and they have some success, but it's very limited. And because at that point, domestic service, as we then knew it, was in a bit of a decline, not as dramatic as is usually parroted. It doesn't vanish after the First World War by any means. I think there's a recent study actually in Mayfair, there are more live-in servants now than there were in 1900. Domestic workers, sorry, I keep using servants as the historic term. But that's one of the things that the union started to say, is we should be referred to as workers. We are not here to serve, we're here to work. So there's that kind of collective sort of feeling of anger and being very hard done by, that is very, very clear in those early writings, but unfortunately it doesn't go very far because it's such an isolating thing. And your employers would go so far as to control when you were allowed to leave the house and who you were consorting with, or absolutely anything. There was very, very little employment protection for domestic workers, even in the early 20th century. Many of the problems that exist today already existed then, about there be no protection, no sort of proper employment framework for domestic workers. and a lot has not improved. Sorry, that's a very pessimistic answer. The only way that people come together is unions. You do also see that there are some nice stories. There's a group of sisters that live together in one of the servant autobiographies I read, and they're all making fun of all the advertising slogans, saying, oh, try Monkey Brand, try Beecham's Pills, and then they all come together and agree that hot water is the only thing that actually works to get dirt out of a carpet. So there are some nice little vignettes of people coming together, but I think my overall research is it can be really solitary and a really isolating act.
I mean, don't be sorry. I think what's very striking is how much what Sophie's talking about in an absolutely current piece of research and your work historically, sadly, have huge resonance, that it doesn't sound like things have gotten hugely better. I wonder, though, what Tommy is telling us, it does suggest a sort of group making practice between students, that students are actually able to create community and a sense of belonging at Queen Mary through doing the housework together. So the kind of relationship of flatmates becomes a really important, it becomes a way of bonding.
Yes, definitely. I think another point I didn't get a chance to touch on was that students read how each other are acting, and if there's any changes to their behavior and or their cleaning regimes. We usually get students approach us saying, oh, X is acting differently. I've noticed they're not coming out of their room, or I've noticed that their dishes are stacking up, and it's a good indicator for us to know that something's going on. You know, I carry out a lot of welfare checks with students who are in need of support or require some level of support, and it gives me sometimes a bit of access all areas to see the condition of their room when I go to visit them, and a lot of time I find that their mental health is reflected in their living space. You know, so a lot of the times my first port of call is to say, right, let's work together. Let's get this space cleaned up. I'm a firm believer in a clean and clear room makes for a clearer mind, and it's always a good starting point to be able to control your environment. Is a good helps you to make the first steps to improving what's going on inside.
Brilliant. I mean, Tommy, you've kind of almost taken us right back to where we started with Rhodri around this idea that our mental health and the state of our mental health actually shows itself in the way we relate to our stuff. I mean, that's fascinating. I'm conscious of the fact that we're running out of time, and we obviously want to make space for Stacey's amazing ritual, which will be starting in a moment. I just want to acknowledge and thank some of the people for the questions that they've offered us. And point to Elsa's question, Rhodri, around the neurotic housewife, which I think is a really interesting category, sort of resonates in some ways with Sophie and Laura's thoughts around the gender and isolation of those cleaning. And also to say thank you for the question around clapping being equivalent to the believing in Tinkerbell during Peter Pan, which is actually a really brilliant parallel that we're making something magical come into being through the act of clapping collectively. And of course, our clapping got quieter and slower and more angry and actually began to fade away. So I'm going to just say huge thanks to the audience for offering those thoughts. They're incredibly helpful. And I'd also like to say an enormous thanks to all the speakers. This has been such a rich discussion. It does feel like it actually deserves a day or two. You could only imagine where we'd get to if we had a chance to really go at this, and preferably in a room where we could say, and first some housekeeping, and actually have coffee and warm white wine together, which is the great ritual of the academic event. I wonder if I could ask the audience silently in the void that you're all in digital world, to applaud our speakers and thank them for their fantastic contributions. I'm applauding you all as well. Thank you so much.